The smoke rising from the trenches mingles with the darkness of the night, and you stand in one of those muddy depths, August 1917, near Passchendaele. Here, in this place closest to hell, you will learn how deep human nature can sink. Sir, there's something there. Sergeant Jenkins's trembling voice rises above the sound of machine guns. You look at him, a man hardened by war, but what you see in his eyes now is something deeper than fear. It is the fear that arises when confronted with something the human mind cannot accept. And at that very moment, the unexpected happens. From the ground, that land ruled by death and decay, a scream rises, a human voice, but not quite. The voice of something that was once human. You freeze, just like the other soldiers, because this voice is the kind that penetrates your soul, the kind that will haunt your dreams. "What do we do, sir?" Jenkins asks again. But you can't answer, because now you see them. 3 silhouettes emerge from the craters, from the mud and blood. 1 in a German uniform, 2 in British uniforms. But the uniforms are now just scraps of cloth on their bodies. These are creatures who have lost their true identities, become savage, ceased to be human. What Lieutenant William Harrington experienced that night would go down in history as one of the most disturbing mysteries of World War I. This 22-year-old young officer, while on a reconnaissance mission with part of the 2nd Devonshire Regiment, would have an unexpected encounter in the depths of no man's land. The night was still, foggy, and gloomy. 3 days had passed since the last German attack, and the cries of wounded soldiers could still be heard in no man's land. Harrington and his men had set out on a mission to search for missing soldiers and rescue them if possible. "We were moving forward with 6 men," Harrington would later write in his diary. Jenkins, Morrison, Palmer, Young, Davies, and me. We were all experienced soldiers, but what we experienced that night, none of us were prepared for. The first sign was the footprints Morrison noticed. In the mud at the edges of the craters, they were irregular and strange, as if the person walking couldn't fully control their legs. But the strangest thing was seeing these tracks leading in different directions, some toward the British trenches, some toward the German trenches. "Who moves like that?" Davies whispered. "It's as if they don't know which side they belong to." Just then, they heard the sound. At first it sounded like a distant moan, but it was getting closer, clearer, and that sound, it was unlike anything they had ever heard. It sounded human, but it didn't. Harrington would describe it. It was like the voice of someone who once knew how to speak, but could now only make primitive sounds. Jenkins was the most experienced soldier in the group. He had been fighting since Mons, had seen countless battles, but that night, Harrington noticed how his rifle trembled in his hands. "Sir," Jenkins said in a shaky voice, "that sound. I know that sound. I heard it last month, on night watch, but the commander wouldn't believe me." The group continued forward, but now each step was more cautious, more anxious. As they moved between the craters, though accustomed to the destruction around them, that night, everything seemed more terrifying. Passing a large crater, Palmer noticed a sudden movement. "Stop," he whispered. "There's someone there." They all froze. Harrington took out his binoculars and scanned the crater. At first he could only see shadows, but then it moved. At the bottom of the crater, buried in mud, was the silhouette of a human. He was wearing a German uniform, but it was so dirty and torn that it was almost unrecognizable. And the man. "God," Harrington whispered. What is he doing?" The man was fiddling with something on the ground. At first, Harrington couldn't tell what it was. But then the horrible truth became clear. The man was rummaging through the pockets of a corpse lying next to him. But that wasn't all. He had something in his mouth. He was chewing it. Young turned away, feeling nauseous. Morrison cursed. But Jenkins raised his gun. "Sir," he said in a firm voice, "that thing isn't human anymore." Just then, a heavy stench began rising from the crater. Decay, blood, and something else, something indescribable. Harrington signaled to his group. They would retreat, silently. But it was too late. The man had raised his head, and now he was looking at them. None of them would ever forget those eyes. Harrington would shudder when he remembered that moment, even years later. The eyes were empty, yet hungry. There was no human intelligence left, only a primal, animalistic hunger. The man slowly stood up. His movements were strange, as if he were just learning to control his body. Blood dripped from his mouth, and he held unidentifiable pieces of flesh in his hands. "Mein Gott," he muttered. But the German accent in his voice was almost unrecognizable. It was as if he remembered only the sounds of the language, but had forgotten their meanings. Jenkins pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the man in the shoulder, knocking him back. But the terrible thing was this. The man just groaned and got back up. He seemed to be in pain, but not the kind of pain a normal human being would feel. More like an animal in distress. "Run!" Harrington shouted. But as the group began to flee, they heard other sounds in the crater. Screams, moans, and worst of all, voices answering them. There were other places, other craters, other things. The creature from the first crater began to follow them. But what really frightened Harrington's group was realizing it wasn't alone. A scream from the left, a response from the right, a flickering light ahead, perhaps a flashlight, perhaps something flammable, and footsteps approaching from behind. "How many are there?" Palmer shouted as he ran. "I don't know," Harrington replied, "but a lot." As they ran, they saw shadows moving in the craters around them. Some wore British uniforms, some German, some French, but they all had the same thing, those empty, hungry eyes and inhuman movements. Davies stumbled and fell. Harrington turned back to help him up. Just then something moved in the crater where Davies had fallen. A hand emerged from the mud, then an arm, then a head. This one was wearing a French uniform, but the uniform looked like it had been worn by someone who had died months ago. The face was no longer a face, just bones, rotting flesh, and those terrible eyes. "Davies!" Harrington pulled his friend's arm just in time, because the thing emerging from the mud was reaching for Davies's foot. As the group continued running, the sounds behind them grew louder. Now there weren't just one or two, but a dozen or more, and they were all following them. "Sir," Young shouted, out of breath, "where did so many come from?" Harrington was asking himself the same question. How long had these things been living here? What were they feeding on? And most importantly, why had they come out now? The answer was horrific but simple. The wounded soldiers who had fallen on no one's land over the past 3 days meant fresh meat for them. Passing the edge of a crater, Morrison suddenly stopped. "Sir, look!" Below, at the bottom of the crater, was a horrific scene. Several bodies lay there, but these were no ordinary war corpses. They had been systematically dismembered. The flesh had been separated from the bones. And around them, Around them were signs of life. Primitive beds made of mud, collected metal scraps, and most chilling of all, primitive tools made from bones. "This is their home," Jenkins whispered. "This is where they live." Just then, a scream rising from behind them snapped them back to reality. Their pursuers were closing in. Harrington turned to look at his group. They had started with 6 men, and there were still 6, but they all wore the same expression. What they had experienced tonight would change them forever. "How far to the British trenches?" asked Davies. 200 meters, replied Morrison, but the sounds behind them were getting closer, and now they saw movement ahead as well. 2 creatures were coming straight toward them, one in an English uniform, one in a German, side by side, as if their nationalities no longer mattered. "Fire!" Harrington shouted. 6 rifles fired simultaneously. The creatures staggered, fell, but a few seconds later they began moving again. "The bullets aren't working," Palmer yelled. "Run. Just run." Finally they reached the British trenches. The sentries pulled them inside and fired behind them. But their pursuers suddenly stopped as they approached the trenches, as if there were an invisible line. They could hunt on anyone's land, but the trenches were another world, the human world. The creatures waited a moment, then turned back into the darkness, the craters, their own dreadful world. Harrington reported what he had seen that night, but no one believed him or wanted to believe him. "Fatigue hallucination," said the commander. "War trauma. Give these men some rest." But Harrington knew what he saw was real. And worse, they were only the beginning, because the savage men living on no one's land weren't just deserters. They were creatures born of the war itself. They were humanity's darkest face, and they were still there when night fell, waiting, hunting, and perhaps planning to multiply. 3 days after Harrington's report, the second encounter took place. This time, there was more than one witness. This time, an entire platoon would experience the same nightmare. Now you're in that trench, too, next to Colonel Morrison, reading the telegram in your hand. The words seem to dance across the paper because you don't want to believe what you're reading. But the truth stands ruthlessly before you. "A company is completely lost, sir," Morrison says in a trembling voice. "The last radio communications. They were saying very strange things. You look at the radio logs. The last message came in at 2:47. They're everywhere. God, they're tearing Mitchell apart. They're not soldiers anymore. They're not human anymore. Help, help." Then silence. Colonel Richard Morrison, 34, from Yorkshire, an experienced commander who had been on the front lines since the beginning of the war, having seen countless battles. But when he took the telegram in his hands that night, he noticed his hands were shaking. Company A was a 40-man reconnaissance squad. Their mission was simple: find the wreckage of a British plane that had crashed on enemy territory and rescue the pilot. A routine mission. At least it was supposed to be. The patrol leader, Captain James Crawford, was a graduate of the War College, a young officer with a bright future. His men trusted him. He trusted himself. "We received the last radio communication at 23:30, Morrison would recall. Crawford reported that they had found the wreckage of the plane, but had no trace of the pilot. He said there were suspicious movements in the area, but that they had not yet made contact. The message at 00:15 was more alarming. There are sounds coming from the old trenches. Screams, moans. Could be Germans, but it sounds different. We're investigating. 1:20. Something's burning up ahead. We're going to check it out. And then the terrible final message. Morrison immediately formed a search party. 2 platoons, 80 men. Strong, well-armed, experienced soldiers. But none of them were prepared for the true nature of the land. You're part of that team. Next to Sergeant Williams, rifle in hand, a metallic taste in your mouth. You can't tell if it's fear or excitement. Maybe both. It's too quiet, says Williams. It shouldn't be this quiet here. He's right. Normally there are always sounds on anyone's turf. Machine gun fire, cannon fire, shouts. But now, the silence of death. Andrews found the first clue. It was the radio operator's device from A Company, stuck in the mud. There were bloodstains nearby, but no body. They dragged him from here, said Thompson, following the tracks. But these footprints, they're very strange. The tracks were strange indeed, sometimes boots, sometimes bare feet, as if different people had passed by at different times. But they all led in the same direction, toward the large crater. The large crater was from the first days of the bombardment, 50 meters in diameter, 15 meters deep. Its interior was filled with mud, spilled materials, and other things. Thompson looks inside with his binoculars. He is silent for a minute, then hands the binoculars to Morrison. "Sir," he says in a trembling voice, "you need to look." Morrison looks. You wait. A minute that feels like an eternity passes. Then Morrison lowers the binoculars. His face is ashen. "God," he whispers. "God, this can't be." He asks for the binoculars back. You look, and what you see will haunt you in your dreams. At the bottom of the crater, among old mud and metal scraps, some kind of camp has been set up. Not tents, but primitive shelters made of metal scraps and mud. Bones and half-eaten pieces of meat lie around. And in the center a large fire is burning. Over the fire, an unrecognizable piece of meat is cooking. But what's truly terrifying are the silhouettes sitting around the fire. 7, maybe 8 people. Different uniforms. British, German, French, all doing the same thing, focused on the meal, in a primitive feast. "How many from A Company are missing?" you whisper. 40, says Morrison. You look again. There are only 8 silhouettes by the fire. Where are the rest? You'll get your answer soon enough. As Morrison prepares to give the order to retreat, you begin to hear sounds around you. At first, distant and indistinct, then close and clear. Screams. But these screams are not cries for help. These are the screams of hunters. They've formed a circle, says Williams. They've surrounded us, and in that moment, you understand. The camp in the crater isn't just a living space. It's also a trap. The first attack comes from the left. 5 silhouettes rise from the mud. They wear torn uniforms, wield primitive weapons, spears made of bone, knives from metal scraps. But the most terrifying thing is their faces. They're not faces anymore. A mixture of decay, mud, and blood. And the eyes. The eyes are completely open. "Fire!" Morrison shouts. The rifles fire. 2 creatures fall, but the others just keep running. The bullets can't stop them. They wound them, slow them down, but they can't stop them. You open fire, too. The first bullet hits the creature in front of you in the chest. It reels back, but stays on its feet. The second bullet hits its shoulder. Again it reels back, again it stays on its feet. You decide to aim for its head with the third bullet. You find your target. The creature rolls to the ground. This time, it doesn't get up. "Shoot it in the head," you yell. "Only headshots work." But this information comes at a high price, because a second attack comes from the right. This time, it's a bigger group. 10, maybe 12 creatures. And among them are faces you recognize from Company A. Williams screams, "Johnson!" It's Johnson. But how? Private Johnson was one of the soldiers reported missing 3 days ago. Now he's standing in front of you, but he's not Johnson anymore. He's wearing the same uniform, has the same facial structure, but his eyes are empty, his mouth is covered in blood, his movements are animalistic. Morrison orders his group to retreat, but it's too late. The creatures have them surrounded in a circle, and now they're approaching systematically. But the most terrifying discovery is this. These aren't just wild strays. They're moving in an organized manner. They're signaling each other, and they have weapons, Thompson says in shock. Normal weapons, indeed. Some are carrying rifles, even using them properly. It's as if they haven't forgotten their military training, but their humanity is gone. The bullet that hits Williams comes from Johnson's rifle, and Johnson doesn't even stop to see where the bullet hits. He just moves on to another target. They still have their military training, Morrison says in horror, but they no longer know who they're fighting for. The group makes their final stand at the edge of the crater. They started with 80 people. Now there are 30 left. The creatures, well, the number of creatures seems to be increasing. You're next to Williams, counting your last bullets. 4 bullets left, 4 headshots, then bayonets. "Williams," you say. "If I go down..." "Shut up," says Williams. "We're getting out of here together." But the truth is clear to both of them. No one will make it out of here alive today, or so you think. Just when it's darkest, something unexpected happens. The sound of machine guns in the distance, then cannon fire, and most importantly, the shouts of British soldiers. Reinforcements have arrived. Lieutenant Harrington reported the situation after his own experience, and command finally took it seriously. 2 battalions, fully equipped, with heavy weapons, are coming. But it's not just soldiers arriving. They have flamethrowers with them. They had learned that the creatures could withstand bullets, but they couldn't withstand fire. When the first flamethrower is fired, the creatures retreat in panic. It's as if the fire awakens the last human instinct they have left, the fear of fire. Morrison's group joins forces with the reinforcements, and now they launch a counter-attack. But as the creatures flee, they leave behind a horrific scene. When they reach the bottom of the crater, they see the full extent of the reality. This isn't just a temporary camp. It's a base that's been in use for months. Tunnels dug in the mud, passages connecting to different craters, and the most terrifying, human figures made of bones, strange symbols drawn in the mud. A kind of place of worship, says the company chaplain, Father Mackenzie, but I don't know what they worshipped. They find the answer in the deepest tunnel of the crater. The walls are decorated with human bones, and in the center, a large figure made of mud. Human-shaped, but larger, more terrifying, and around it, the bodies of new victims, the survivors of Company A. They worship them, Father Mackenzie says in a trembling voice. They worship the war itself. They cleanse the entire crater with flamethrowers. They burn the tunnels, destroy the mud figures. But they know this. This is not the only base. No one's territory is vast. Hundreds of craters, thousands of kilometers, and in every crater, Other groups of savage men may be living. As Morrison writes his final report, he notices his hand is trembling. These savage men, he writes, are not just deserters. They are creatures born of the war itself, beings who have lost their humanity, existing only to live the war. And I fear, he continues, they are only the beginning. The longer the war lasts, the more these creatures will multiply. November 1918. The war is over, but voices can still be heard on everyone's land. Now you are in that silence on the old battlefield. You came as a tourist, but you are actually searching for something. Because some nights, people who live near the old trenches still say they hear screams. And occasionally people who go for walks disappear. The official explanation is always the same: accident, disappearance, animal attack. But you know the truth. The wild men are still there, waiting, continuing to live, and maybe they're looking for new members. You're standing at the edge of the old crater. The sun is setting, and from far away, very far away, you think you hear a scream. But it's just the wind, isn't it? Just the wind. World War I was one of the most horrific conflicts humanity has ever experienced. But perhaps what was truly horrific was the kind of change this war wrought in people. The stories of savage men are recorded only as rumors, but behind every rumor lies a grain of truth. And as you lie in bed at night, listening to these stories, do you look out the window and wonder, are they still out there? Is the war really over? Or has it just changed form? Whatever you do, may God be with you.